The average cost to educate a child on base in America, not our foreign bases, not where we actually need private school, is over $51,000 per year per student. We could consolidate that program, which like we do, all but 16 bases, and over 10 years save $9 billion. $9 billion. They have STEM programs. They have 103 different STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math programs within the Pentagon alone. Consolidating those would save $1.7 billion over the next 10 years. These are programs that are not necessarily initiated by Congress either, I might say. So they do have the flexibility on a lot of these programs to make those changes. Department of Defense Tuition Assistance Program, it totally duplicates our Veterans Tuition Assistance Program. So you can be in service, have this access to tuition while you're in service, and then have the identical access to tuition afterwards, and you can claim them both. So we have multiple duplications there. There's nothing wrong with wanting to give an educational benefit to our troops, but we don't need to do it twice. That's a significant savings of $4.5 billion. Alternative energy. We have a Department of Energy. Their whole goal is to work on alternative energy and renewable energy and efficiency within energy. The Department of Defense is spending $700 million a year on research in alternative energy that totally duplicates everything we're doing everywhere else. So there's $700 million that we should not be spending at the Pentagon for something that's already being done somewhere else. We also know that we have a benefit for our military families called the PX and commissaries. But when you go out and price products, what you find is you can actually buy at retail stores at a lower price than you can the commissary. And yet, the cost of running all those organizations, we could give every troop an additional $1,000 a year and save $5 billion over the next 10 years and give them $1,000 more, and they'll be able to buy at lower prices from a commercial vendor versus a commissary. Overhead support and supply services, over 300,000 military members performing civilian-type jobs. In other words, these are trained Army, Marine, Navy, and Air Force personnel that are trained as warfighters. We have them doing non-military jobs in the Pentagon, which we could put civilian employment in, have these people available to be warfighters, and we could save $37 billion over the next 10 years, just in the differential in what our total costs are for the two different types of employees. So when we talk about a sequester of taking $85 billion, I've just given you over $85 billion over 10 years, and just by looking at a few programs. So when we hear the number, and we think about the federal government being twice the size it was 11 years ago, and that we're 27% higher in terms of discretionary spending in non-defense, and that even if sequester goes through as it is now planned for the military expenditures will actually still be greater next year than what they are this year. So it's important that we talk honestly with the American people about where we are on these projects. Let me just for a second talk about, we put out a report called the Waste Book. We put it out every year. We gave 100 examples of the most egregious ways tax dollars were wasted last year. $450,000 for an unused airport in my state. $325,000 for robot squirrels. This is a grant that was issued to study what we already know about robotic squirrels and their interactions with rattlesnakes. I can't see that that's a priority for us in a time when we're running $1.2 trillion deficits, that we need to be spending money on that type of research. We spend $91 million a year giving and you won't believe this, charitable status to the NFL, the PGA, and several other sports. So the profits that they make, the PGA, defers taxes coming to the federal government in terms of $91 million a year. Now, I don't know a pro sports team that isn't in the business for being profitable. But there are organizations where they send a lot of this money through. We are now hiding that money from the tax code. That's $91 million a year. Why are we doing that? $27 million was spent by the State Department on pottery classes in Morocco. The whole project was an abject failure, but the question we ought to be asking is, why are we spending $27 million on pottery classes in Morocco? Could we spend $27 million and have a better effect for the Moroccan people than a failed pottery class program? And the answer is certainly we could. The size of the State Department's twice the size it was 5 years ago, twice the size in terms of total expenditures. The other thing we talked about was the subsidy to the rich and famous in terms of what's out there. On average, we found $30 billion a year that millionaires, people who make at least $1 million a year, enjoy and benefits from tax giveaways and federal grant programs. That's $30 billion a year. That's $300 billion. That's over a third of what we're talking about on the sequestration. And yet we've done nothing on it. This has been out for a year. $74 million of unemployment checks went to millionaires last year. $74 million to people who made $1 million, but we still paid them unemployment. $316 million to people who are making more than $1 million a year farming. We sent them $316 million worth of subsidies. We sent them $89 billion for preservation of their ranches and their estates. These are people that are making more net income, adjusted gross income above $1 million a year. We sent them $9 billion of retirement checks. We sent them $75.6 million in energy tax credits for their homes. We sent them $7.5 million to cause for damages and emergencies to property that should have been served. And we also gave them a write-off on their gambling losses in excess of $3 billion. The other thing that I found very unusual as we looked at this is people making an adjusted gross income in excess of $1 million a year. We gave them $16 million in government-backed education loans. $16 million in government-backed education loans. One of the other areas that we did a study on was the market access program. We've all heard of Sunkist and Welch's and Blue Diamond. In 2012, we paid them $6 million from the taxpayers to help them sell their products overseas. These are $100 million corporations, minimally. They're billion-dollar corporations. We don't do that to all the rest of the corporations in this country, but because they happen to be associated with an agricultural program and we have a market access program, we decided that the very well-to-do corporations will subsidize their promotion of their products overseas. That may be a laudable goal, but in a time of priorities, it's not a laudable goal. Over $2 billion has been spent on this program, which has indirectly subsidized their advertising costs. $2 billion to very profitable agricultural companies who, if you go and look on their 10Ks, their SEC reports, they're doing just fine. They don't need the federal taxpayer to do this. California wine industry, which had domestic sales of $18 billion in 2009. It's higher than that now. They got $7 million for this. And the American cotton industry received $20 million and had another $4.7 million from a separate USDA market access programs. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about for a minute, more than $70 billion in federal funds have been left unspent years after they've been appropriated. We've got $70 billion sitting out there in accounts that has been obligated but not spent, older than 5 years old, which means it's never going to get spent. So that money's sitting in a bank of management because people didn't use the money. So we're borrowing an extra $70 billion every year to fund the government when we have $70 billion out there in accounts that should revert back to the Treasury. At the end of this year, the federal government had $2 trillion in unexpended funds. This is according to OMB. This is not the congressional budget. This is the Office of Management and Budget. 2/3 of this amount was obligated, but 1/3 of it wasn't obligated. So you have $650 billion in unobligated balances sitting on the federal government that we're not shuffling around to direct to the things that are most important. Let me just finish up. I want to make one other point. I got a letter this week from the mayor of a medium-sized town in my state. It's the mayor of McAlester, Oklahoma. And I'm going to enter this letter into the record because in this letter you see a demonstration of the kind of leadership that's needed when you have a financial problem in front of you. And let me read this. The city of McAlester is currently working hard to rebalance our budget after a sudden downturn in our revenue over the past 2 months. As you know, municipalities in Oklahoma are required by statute to maintain a balanced budget. You have to have a balanced budget. So what has he done? First step, we implemented a hiring freeze. They reassigned workers. Revenue shortfall was estimated at $1.2 million, so that budget, every other expense category, including supplies, repairs, maintenance, fuels, utilities, travel, training, consulting services, and legal services, had their budgets reduced. In other words, they responded, none of these cuts are without gain, without pain, but all will be accomplished while maintaining essential city services. Now, for McAlester, a $1.2 million budget cut is a bigger hit than we're talking about with sequestration. And yet, if the mayor of a 25,000 population community, can make the adjustments to serve his constituency without decreasing services, why can't we? And I'd ask unanimous consent to enter this into the record.
Without objection.
The final point I would make is the following. A little less than 3 years ago, I guess it's a little more than 3 years ago, we passed an amendment that I offered that forced the Government Accountability Office, the Government Accounting Office, and the Comptroller General to identify every program in the federal government. Not only to identify it, but to outline where we have duplications and overlaps. And they've done a wonderful job. We're going to get the last report, the last third of that, April 1st, about a month from today. But what do we know so far? We know that we've got about $370 billion in the first 2/3 of this, where they say there's massive duplication. This is $370 billion worth of expenditures a year. And I know I've talked with the president. He disagrees with me on this. But when you think about it, you know, we have 47 separate job training programs, of which all but 3 overlap. They're highly ineffective in total. Why don't we have 2 or 3? We spend almost $19 billion on those programs. We could spend $9 billion, cut it down to 3 programs, put metrics on it, and make sure it's working. And the reason I know it's not working is I looked at every job training program in my own state. And the ones that are most successful are the ones that are totally state-run without any federal government interference. And the ones that are federally run, some are good, I will give you that, but most are not. Most are not successful in efficiently and effectively giving somebody a life skill and getting them into employment. We have 253 different duplicative Department of Justice grant programs. $2 billion a year. If you're needing a grant, you might apply at DOJ in this one of these 203, and then you might apply again over here for the same thing to another one. And the fact is the Government Accounting Office says, we don't know if people aren't double and triple. And matter of fact, what have we found? We have people getting the same amount of money from different grant programs for the same grant application. So what we have is tremendous problems. We just discovered in the state of Oklahoma that we have a housing administrator for a city that has no houses. There's 3,700 housing administrators in the United States, probably closer to 4,000. We're still counting. Some of those have very big responsibilities. I don't mean to demean it at all. But couldn't we consolidate those, especially in the areas of rural Oklahoma and the rural states, to where we spread that overhead and we have fewer housing administrators? We spend, we have 56 financial literacy programs. Now think about that for a minute. 56 different programs to supposedly for the federal government to create a program to make you financially literate. First of all, there's a problem with that because we're not financially literate, borrowing $1.2 trillion a year. Number two is we don't know what the word efficiency and effectiveness is in the federal government, or at least limited knowledge for that. And finally, why do we have that many financial literacy programs? There's no sane reason or no sane answer to that question. As I outlined in some of the others, 160 housing assistant programs, $170 billion a year. We have 53 programs across 4 agencies to help entrepreneurs. The federal government's helping entrepreneurs. Our entrepreneurial spirit is really not very active and not very successful in terms of what we're doing within the government. And yet we spend $2.6 billion on that. We have 15 different separate unmanned aerial aircraft programs within the federal government. We're going to spend $37 billion on that. Why do we have 15? Maybe 2 or 3 because we have different requirements, but 15? So the massive amount of duplication that's going on within the federal government, which implies massive amounts of duplicative administrative and overhead costs, I would bet that a third of what's happening in Sequester, if you just consolidated programs, didn't eliminate any, just consolidated the management, you could save a third of what the Sequester is just from the administrative overhead associated with them. So when you hear discussions about that we shouldn't be doing the Sequester, that the Sequester is going to be painful, and it is, I don't deny that, but it doesn't have to be. And all it takes is a small drop of common sense, both in Congress and the executive branch, to work our way through these problems. So my hope is that the president will work with us on giving him flexibility in terms of managing this. Remember, $85 billion really isn't 85. It's only going to be about 44. That's what we're talking about. It is disproportionately heavy on the defense, but I can show lots of areas. I know I have a lot of colleagues on my side that disagree with me on the waste that's in the Pentagon, but I've seen it, I've looked at it, and I've had a lot of people inside the military call me and talk to me about the waste that's there. You know, we now have an admiral for every ship we have in the Navy. Nobody else has that anywhere else in the world. And with that comes an average of 200 other employees per admiral. So the question is can we do this? Should we do it? And can we do it in a way that is best for the American people? We're going to cut this money one way or the other. And it's not because a Republican wants to cut it or because the president wants to cut it or a Democrat wants to cut it. We're going to cut it because the math in our future is going to force us to cut it. And I know people don't think discretionary programs have much of the problem with what we're spending money on. But I would surmise that well over 15% of everything we do in discretionary spending, including the Pentagon, is not effective or efficient. With that, I yield the floor, Mr. President.